Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Monday, July 28th, day 661 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Hi, Lazar. Thanks for joining me today.
Hi, Amanda. Good morning.
Good morning. We will drill down into the new Israeli humanitarian aid efforts inside and above the Gaza Strip. We'll speak about France's recent declaration of its intention to recognize a Palestinian state in September and the ripple effect that this is causing. And we'll hear about a Shabbat miracle when the home of a Chabad rabbi in Ukraine was hit by a deadly Russian missile attack while he and his family were sleeping. All this and more when we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Yesterday, aircraft from Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Jordan airdropped dozens of packages, pallets of humanitarian aid into the northern and southern Gaza Strip. This morning, Israel says more than 120 truckloads of food aid was distributed by the United Nations and aid agencies in the Gaza Strip in the first day of a partial 10-hour pause in fighting in some areas. With all the world's attention on the threat of starvation in the Gaza Strip, Israel's actions in this arena are even more scrutinized than usual. So, Lazar, you wrote a piece about how you see Israel's newly softened position playing out. Tell us more.
Yeah, so I guess my main point here is how shocking it is that this article that I wrote in April 2024 could have been, I could have just taken basically the exact same points, the exact same criticism, and used it here. Meaning that after October 7th, and this is somewhat understandable given the shock, there was all sorts of statements in the days following the attack that we're going to block fuel from going in, there's going to be a total siege, no food, no water. And then on every single one of Israel's tough demands, promises, eventually and inevitably and predictably, Israel had to go back on them, right? So food and water and fuel within the first weeks were going in. And then Israel made all of these promises as if it mattered somehow how the aid got there, that none of it will come through the Ashdod port. It's not going to go through Kerem Shalom. Well, under pressure from the U.S., they opened Kerem Shalom, and then they opened the Ashdod port. And then after that, in April, the WCK killing, the killing of 7 aid workers from the World Central Kitchen, that's when they had to prove how forthcoming they were being with aid. So they had to extend hours in Kerem Shalom, permanently open the Ashdod port, and started even bragging about how much aid was going in. And that's when I wrote that Israel cannot play games with humanitarian aid. It is irrelevant to the outcome of the war. Hamas is not going to starve. The people of Gaza are not going to take out their anger on Hamas and overthrow Hamas because they're hungry. It's simply not going to happen. And Hamas isn't going to free hostages because of that. That was, 16 months ago? And then you look back to where we are now, and after the January to March of this year ceasefire, again, Israel started talking about, very explicitly, humanitarian aid again as the key to winning the war. They started saying very unequivocal things, that aid is funding Hamas's terror machine against us, and we're not going to continue doing that. And you had a spokesman say that the aid that we bring into Gaza kills us, right? And it feeds the very people, the very Hamas guards that are starving our hostages. That's what they said in March. And predictably, Israel let the situation get out of hand, right? It announced very proudly that there was going to be this total stoppage of aid going into Gaza. And then they, in May, unrolled the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which they said would be the key to separating Hamas from the population, or the population from Hamas. And we've talked about how they let, day after day, they could not keep these situations from occurring in which mostly the IDF was firing at crowds of people who were somewhere around the GHF going the wrong way. Troops felt threatened, whatever it was. Dozens of people were regularly dying on their way to get aid. And they totally lost control of the narrative and had all these restrictions in place, even though a lot of aid was going in, but Israel didn't want to talk about it. But the distribution was so bad that you really had growing famine, growing hunger, and growing criticism until last week. It really reached this apex. It reached a crescendo where you had 28 Western countries, or mostly Western countries, mostly allies, saying that because of the aid situation, the war in Gaza must end. And you had over 100 aid organizations and NGOs say that. And you had growing pressure from within Israel as well. You had news organizations which hadn't been focusing on this, which started being more vocal. So Israel misplayed the aid thing so badly that it wasn't something that helped Israel get closer to its goals, but quite the opposite. It made it more likely that Israel would be under pressure, or Israel was under pressure to end the war before it achieved the goals because of the way it handled the aid situation. So it didn't learn the lessons from April 2024 and made all these mistakes again, spent all of this goodwill and international support. And now we're back in the situation where Kogat, the IDF, is bragging again about how much aid it's letting in. And we've lost control in the future, right? Because now the pipeline, we have this, we'll talk about this UAE pipeline going from Egypt into Gaza. That's something that in the future we probably won't be able to have any control over at all. So we've harmed our interests in many, many ways. Listen, there are smart people at the top of the Israeli military, security, and governing structure. These are the same people that came up with these incredible operations against Hezbollah and this very complex, quite successful operation, over 1,000 kilometers away in Iran, and making the same mistakes, predictable mistakes that people like me who are on the outside could see happening from a mile away. And here we are again, and victory, I think, is no closer than where it was. It's even further away because of the way we've handled the aid.
Right. The idea that this war could have been won with a siege mentality, meaning how the Roman Empire won so many wars, including in the Holy Land, that's impossible to carry out right now in the social media era. But on the other hand, Israel had another choice. The other choice would have been to flood the Gaza Strip with aid. And that was a choice that could have happened at the outset. But it was the anger, of course, this righteous anger that, rightfully so, after the October 7th, 2023 massacre of 1,200 on Israeli soil, that could not happen. However, just as we've seen throughout this war, different pivots, different enterprises that came and went. Anyone remember the Biden pier off the coast of Gaza? There can be new ways of getting the aid in. And I just wonder, Lazar, with all of your, passion, I wonder if you think that Israel could also turn to this idea of flooding the Strip, not in a cynical pat you on the back kind of way, but in a strategic manner.
Let's remember the Gaza Pure thing, and I wrote about this as well, and we talked about it. This massive waste of money where that kept breaking apart, and some soldiers got injured and had no meaningful effect on anything. It was just a big waste of time and a waste of resources. The way to get aid to people is on the ground with many distribution sites and multiple distribution sites, and when people know that it's going to come predictably, you won't have this violence. It doesn't mean Israel is under no responsibility to fund Hamas, right? And to give it anything that supports its war effort. It's very clear in Article 23 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is the only document which requires Israel to be sending in aid, but it's very clear a commander can stop doing that if he believes it's aiding the enemy. And that's true in the U.S. Law of War Manual absolutely says siege warfare against the enemy forces is absolutely legitimate. So one way to do that is just to flood the zone and say humanitarian aid isn't an issue, even though Hamas, of course, this happens everywhere. Everywhere where there's aid coming in, the strongest force is going to find a way to assert itself and to show that it controls, because it controls what happens. And this is an important way to show that. If Israel was going to be a little bit more imaginative and speak a little bit more responsibly, you certainly have opportunities, and you could still do this, of making very, very well-resourced areas for civilians that once they cross through some sort of check, they're there, they get education, health, all these other things. What is keeping, now there's a lot of criticism because Israel Katz, the defense minister, is talking about this humanitarian city. I think a humanitarian city is a great idea, right? That should have been done from the beginning. It would have saved a lot of life. The problem is you have Israeli leaders talking about it as step one to kind of the Trump idea of voluntary immigration. Absolutely, those two things should have been separated. And also, Israel's not willing to think about the day after. And if they were willing to and did have an aim of where they wanted to end up, even if it's not a perfect solution, let's say like the Palestinian Authority, which is corrupt and venal and hates us and anti-Semitic and all the things, 100%. They're not going to threaten us from the Gaza Strip, right? They have no interest in doing that, and they're going to be too busy trying to hold on to their own power there. That's an imperfect solution, which gets us toward our war aims. So then we could be we could be slowly handing over anywhere we're giving aid in the aid process to this other entity. So it's not us doing it, but we're a part of it. We're overseeing it. And then we're slowly creating the reality, the post-Hamas reality with the aid. That would take a lot of willingness to stare down the far right of the coalition and some people that just are just angry and hate everything that's the Palestinian Authority and want the Palestinian people to suffer. That's not a way to make policy. It's certainly not a way to win the war.
And just as you and I discussed in our Friday focus last week about this strategic plus of having the Christian Zionists on our side, we also need to remember, Israel needs to remember that the Jewish diaspora is slowly fading in its support because of the terrible pictures that are coming out of the Gaza Strip. And many of the so-called liberal Zionists are now blatantly from the pulpit calling for Israel to stop the war, to stop the suffering of the Gazan people. And so when you lose this component of the strategic efforts that Israel has throughout the world, our biggest ambassadors throughout the world could be the Jewish people throughout the world, then you have to wonder, why is Israel not also making some kind of rethink? Let's leave this topic here and talk about how Egypt is playing a role right now. And yesterday we heard that the Rafah border crossing was opened, that some aid came in through there for the first time in a very long time. And you mentioned in passing this pipeline that is being established by the UAE and Egypt into Gaza. So let's talk about this a little bit.
Yeah, so Egypt used to be, before Israel captured Rafah and the crossing there, which in Philadelphia corridor on the border, that infuriated Egypt. And before that, Egypt was kind of the main hub for goods that were being unloaded at the port and then were being driven across the Sinai, not across the whole thing, but through the northern Sinai to the Rafah crossing and then into Gaza. Now, that was very important for Egypt. It made it a central player. It also made a lot of money on facilitating this transfer. But once Israel captured that border, any aid would go into Israel and then through Kerem Shalom. Egypt certainly wants to return to be the key player in terms of aid. You saw over, I believe it was over 100 trucks, really a massive amount go in. But again, this went through Israel and then through Kerem Shalom. And then this UAE project. Now, the UAE throughout the war has really made a strategic shift and has decided that the Palestinian issue is going to be important to it. It's not vocal like, let's say, Turkey, which bashing Israel, not at all, but it wants to be a player in terms of aid and reconstruction projects and field hospitals. So it is, this is one of its multifaceted efforts there in terms of having water go from a plant, desalinization plant in Egypt, into the Mawasi area, which is that coastal area in southern Gaza Strip, which classically was inhabited by Bedouins. And that's where 600,000 Gazans are sheltering right now. So this will give them a reliable source of water. And again, I'm stressing that if Israel did not play this game with aid since March, then Israel could have the water going from Israel and it could get the credit for it. And it also would have control over it if Hamas ever tries to play around with it. So again, it'll relieve some of the situation in the Gaza Strip. It makes that Mawasi area kind of a more permanent humanitarian area. So Israel can think about what that means. It's good because it is working with Egypt. It's working with the UAE on this. Obviously, this has to happen with Israeli cooperation. If Israel is smart right now, they'll use it as a lever to make bigger things happen and to really make sure we don't get into this situation with aid again. And we can focus on defeating Hamas. Let's just not forget that there are more and more people, especially you hear this from Trump also, and I don't think he's only talking about just what he's thought of, but he's probably heard this from people as well, that he seems to have given up any hope for a negotiated solution. And I don't think that's a crazy idea. Or a negotiated ceasefire and hostage release. As we get closer and closer to Hamas having, or as Hamas has fewer and fewer quote unquote assets, which sadly to say are the hostages, of course it is going to be much more difficult to get them out. And right now, Hamas is saying that we're not releasing them unless we know that the war is going to end and we have survived. That's victory for them. And since Israel is not about to let that happen, um, in my opinion, the chances of bridging that very, very large gap, almost an unbridgeable gap, I think are low and getting lower. So we have to think about, okay, what happens next in this war? It could be that it's at some point Israel has to decide it's just going to be the military efforts. And then we really have to make sure that the humanitarian situation is taken care of so we're able to pursue the military campaign as effectively and with as much freedom of action as possible. Again, no guarantee that it'll happen. It could be that the sides are able to actually bridge this, or Hamas really believes that Israel's finally going into the final 25%. But whatever happens, the aid situation and the welfare of Gazan civilians is going to be something that everyone pays a lot of attention to.
Let's go to a short break. And we're back. I'm Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our diplomatic correspondent, Lazar Berman. Let's think in terms of diplomacy and how things such as France's decision last week to announce its intention to declare a Palestinian state in September affects things. There's a huge ripple effect in all of this kind of a public declaration that potentially was not thought of. And one thing that springs to my mind is how this affects the ceasefire negotiations. And so, with all the scrutiny on Israel, with all the world's eyes on Israel right now, because of the humanitarian situation and the terrible pictures of the children who are visibly in, life-threatening situations right now, then we add to this prize, shall we say, to the Palestinian people, in which France is publicly recognizing, or will publicly recognize in September, a Palestinian state. How does that make Hamas react at the negotiating table?
So, France would justify this by saying we are strengthening the non-Hamas side, the Palestinian Authority, by demanding that they reform. So Israel should want this, and showing that they can deliver something that Hamas cannot deliver. But I think most observers, including Palestinians, would say, why do we have France? And then earlier we had Norway, Spain, Ireland, Slovenia recognize a Palestinian state. It's clearly in the aftermath of October 7th, meaning this Hamas argument that in order for good things to happen to the Palestinian cause, because it was stuck, we need to slaughter a bunch of Jews, and that's how we will serve the interests of the Palestinian people. They're giving them evidence. These European countries are giving them evidence for that claim. I think it's horribly irresponsible. I know the European diplomats don't like it when I say this, but it is, the metaphor would be making October 7th Palestinian Independence Day. It's a terrible idea. If you want the Palestinian national movements to give up the idea of getting what they want through violence and terrorism, and to understand that what they want will come through recognizing Israel, recognizing the Jewish people's legitimate presence and claims to a national homeland here, that is not the way to do it. It really is not the way to do it. And Israel has criticized Macron for what Hamas will say, and Hamas, has been pays very close attention to international and domestic pressure on this government and on Israel. And they'll say, okay, I can dig in more because we just got this huge prize from France, the most powerful European country to recognize a Palestinian state, it would seem. And who knows what else could happen as we hold out. More pressure on Israel, more countries recognizing us. We know that the UK, so far they haven't said they would do this, but Starmer is calling back his cabinet for an emergency meeting. You had a letter from a third of the parliament, obviously mostly Labour, calling for Starmer to follow Macron's lead. So, there's a lot of reason for Hamas to say, why don't we wait a little bit longer, see what other good things happen? We see that Israel has been moving toward our demands. Even without this, maybe we wait longer. There'll be more and more pressure to move toward the demands. The counterweight is that Trump has said things that are so clearly in Israel's favor, and that Hamas just wants to die, and Hamas doesn't want a deal. Hopefully, Hamas will realize that as well, and that what Trump says matters a lot more than what Macron says.
Right, but it's always a question with Trump. And as you said, so far, he has been rather consistent, at the same time acknowledging the terrible suffering in Gaza. And today, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is meant to press Donald Trump on ending the suffering in Gaza. They're meeting up at the US president's golf resort in your favorite country, Lazar, aside from Israel, in Scotland today. And so it is a little amazing that diplomacy will take place on the golf course, but why not? I'm sure it has before and will again.
For Trump, it certainly does.
For sure. And so you have to wonder, how will this conversation with Starmer affect Trump moving forward?
I don't think it will. I'm sure Trump has been getting pressure all over the place from countries on Gaza and on Israel, but he has been pretty firm. But I'm sure he's also getting quiet pressure from Gulf states as well. And we know that they want Hamas gone. They don't want to see a Palestinian starve, and they don't want that domestic pressure, but they certainly want Hamas gone. And of course, Israel has his ear as well. And some important, as we've talked about, Christian Zionists are, probably his largest piece of his coalition. So I don't think Starmer is going to be able to move Trump, but the question is, can domestic politics move Starmer? And that's an interesting question as well.
Right. Did you know that there are other wars in the world besides the one that's happening right now in the Gaza Strip?
I am aware, and there's, and some places that there have been plenty of wars before: India, Pakistan, Cambodia, Thailand, Ethiopia. A lot of other wars are going on, but the focus is, of course, as always, Israel and its neighbors.
But let's turn to Ukraine for a second. And the home of a Chabad rabbi in Dnipro was hit during a deadly Russian missile attack on the central Ukrainian city early Saturday, otherwise known as Shabbat. And Rabbi Moshe Weber was asleep at 3:45 a.m. in his central Dnipro apartment with his wife and 4 of his 11 children when a Russian missile hit the residential tower. So Weber leads the Kollel Torah in Ukraine, which is a network of Torah learning centers operating with over 5,000 participants. He'd just come back from camp in Poland, and you spoke with him yesterday. So what did he tell you about this Shabbat miracle?
Yeah, I just want to stress it was like a fun summer camp in Poland. Just want to make sure that
right.
that's clear.
Good
right?
point. Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I spoke to him. He said, listen, the last time there was a serious attack on the city itself was around Passover time in April. So they had come back, they had a very nice time in Poland. There were some warnings that there was expectations that Russia would be launching in the area, but it's not like Israel where you have these shelters. The shelter is the parking garage under the building. They said, okay, we're not going to go down, whatever, it's been quiet. And they woke up, again, middle of the night. He said he looked out the window. He heard a huge boom. Everyone woke up. He looked out the window. He saw like bricks falling. He saw glass broken. And he thought there was a strike near his building. He didn't realize it was his building. Opened the door, darkness, sirens. There was a water main broken. Went outside, and then he looked back up and saw indeed it was his building. Even his porch was hit. But when he was able to go back in about 7:30 a.m., he says it was a miracle because there was no damage inside his apartment. He talked about the mezuzot he has. He has all this stuff from the Lubavitcher Rebbe and things like that. And he said that is what is protecting us, them. And he's been watching over the work of the Chabad rabbis and of the Jewish community in general during the war. When I was there for my 4 reporting trips, it's just every single time, every person you talk to has these incredible stories. The Jewish community in general has really shown its resilience and its organizational abilities to continue to provide not only food and care and what they're providing Holocaust survivors, but continuing to have schools and summer camps and everything a community needs. And when I was there, I would see how much non-Jewish Ukrainians relied on Jewish networks. So I was there when the rabbi in Kyiv delivered air conditioners that were given from Jewish donors to hospitals where wounded Ukrainian soldiers were recovering, or that the police would just show up at the synagogue and say what their sudden needs are, and they would be able to get packages from the synagogue, or just refugees would know that you go to a synagogue and you'll be able to get food and be able to sleep there. So it's really been incredible, inspiring. I'd love to go back and report some more, but this is just another case of the important work that rabbis are doing, that Chabad rabbis are doing, of course, the Weber family is doing in maintaining this really much bigger than you think, and also this beautiful Jewish community in a place where Jews are one of the first, peoples who have been in that country. It's Greeks and Jews were there before anyone was speaking Ukrainian. So I think it's an important thing that they're there, and we should be happy that continues to be thriving Jewish life, especially in this place, Dnipro, that has this huge Jewish community center building, this menorah center, which is probably the biggest in Europe. So all this work has gone into creating this community, or maintaining this community, and it's good to see that despite all the war and despite all the killing and effort and hardships, that this community continues, and that there are leaders there, and that Judaism continues in Ukraine.
If I'm not mistaken, the day of war in Ukraine is something like 1,250, which is basically double our 661. So definitely thank you for keeping tabs on what's going on there and bringing that story to us today, Lazar.
Absolutely, it's important, and like you said, there's plenty of other wars going on, and that was dominated headlines from 2022 until October 7th, 2023. But yeah, it's important that we keep an eye on that and hopefully get back there to report.
Lazar, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, shalom.